So let's talk about Frank Wisner, a name that doesn't come up enough, even though he played a massive role in shaping modern intelligence work. And when I say massive, I mean groundbreaking. Early on, Wisner spearheaded the CIA's covert operations through the Office of Policy Coordination, which he practically built from the ground up. Here's the thing. Back in 1948, the Italian elections were seen as a turning point in the fight against communism. Wisner was instrumental in making sure the election leaned pro-Western. How? By using psychological warfare and leveraging media manipulation in ways that were, well, both genius and a little terrifying. Can you imagine pulling those strings from the shadows? Psychological warfare isn't just about military strategy. It's about shaping public opinion. For Wisner, it included planning rumors, staging propaganda campaigns, and even smuggling Western media, like The Guardian, into Eastern Europe during the Cold War. I mean, think about it. Those efforts outright challenged censorship and helped spread ideas that were otherwise suppressed. But you've got to ask, at what cost? And that's where it gets murky. These covert operations saved lives, supported democracy, or at least that's one way to frame it. But they also sparked ethical debates that we're still having today. Like, should we be meddling in other nations' politics to this extent? Did Wisner's work set a dangerous precedent? Did the end justify the means? The thing is, Wisner wasn't immune to criticism. The CIA's controversial actions under his leadership, particularly during the Cold War, drew public scrutiny. Rightfully so in some cases. It's one of those cases where you got this brilliant leader caught up in the complexities of doing what's necessary versus what's right. And these ethical dilemmas aren't ancient history. They echo in today's political strategies and how governments justify interference, psychological tactics, and, let's be honest, propaganda. So the question becomes, have we learned anything from Wisner's playbook, or are we just remixing it? You know, it's wild to think about how one audacious hoax can expose so much about our entire political system. That's exactly what a group of liberal satirists did with what's now called America's hoax of the century. And honestly, it's brilliant. They staged this elaborate act that was almost like reverse engineering misinformation, all to critique the way media narratives get built, and of course, how people just eat them up. Here's where it gets tricky, though. Satire doesn't just poke holes in the system, it walks this fine line between truth and fabrication. So, while it can punch up, it can also blur boundaries in ways that, let's face it, might end up feeding distrust. Distrust in media, distrust in institutions, in each other. And isn't that exactly what democracy can't afford? Because think about it. When satire starts playing with misinformation, even if the intention's good, it risks crossing over into dangerous territory. We're talking about reinforcing those post-truth dynamics where feelings replace facts, where you can dismiss reality as just someone else's opinion. It's this slippery slope, is it not? But here's the thing. Humor is transformative. It challenges systems. It disrupts power in ways that feel accessible. That's what makes satire so powerful. It speaks to everyone, but it can't exist in a vacuum. Misinformation thrives in the same ecosystem. And well, they're kind of feeding off each other, are they not? So the big question here is, how do we separate satire that reveals truth from satire that distorts it? And maybe even more importantly, how do we as a society that's so flooded with information know the difference anymore? Here's the wild thing about history. It doesn't just inform today, it kind of repeats itself, right? Take Cold War disinformation strategies, for instance. If you compare what happened then to what's happening now, the parallels are honestly chilling. Back then, it was all about planting seeds of doubt, shaping narratives through media. And today, well, isn't that just amplified times 1,000 on social platforms? Look at Russian interference in the 2016 elections. Same playbook, different tools. They exploited existing divisions, flooded spaces with fake stories. It's like, how much can you overwhelm people until they stop knowing what to believe? And let's admit it, the Cold War masters of disinformation would have been, I don't know, kind of impressed. But we didn't just inherit those strategies, we've supercharged them. Enter artificial intelligence, and that opens up a whole new can of worms. AI can create fake videos, mimic voices. I mean, think about it. AI technology can manufacture proof for disinformation campaigns faster than we can fact check it. How do you even begin to regulate that? And then there's the ethics. Because sure, you could use AI to expose lies, but how far do we let that go before it crosses its own line? Are we just falling into a tech-fueled arms race of deception? It's like the Cold War, but the stakes feel bigger, more digital. And when trust is already fragile, do we really want to gamble with that? So what's the solution here? Well, let's circle back to history. The Cold War taught us that you can't fight disinformation with more secrecy. It's about resilience, about building public trust. Democracies need transparency, accountability, the kind of stuff that prevents manipulation from taking root in the first place. But how do we make sure those lessons stick in a world that's drowning in information? We must also take into account the new Cold Wars. Yes, the new Cold Wars. Let's take a look at this clip of David Sanger speaking about the new Cold Wars, its very real and present threat, and how many past and present presidents are guilty of wishful thinking. Play this clip.
New wars, China's rise, Russia's invasion, and America's struggle to defend the West by the New York Times' David Sanger. David, thanks so much. Pleasure to have you back on the News Hour.
Great to be with you, Nick.
How, as you write, did bipartisan faith in globalization become, quote, what you call the fantasy era of first-century foreign policy?
After the fall of the Berlin Wall, there was just an assumption, flawed assumption, clearly, that Russia and China, each for their own very different reasons, would pursue their economic interests. And the theory was that this was such an overwhelming imperative for both countries that it would override China's interests in Taiwan. Russia would set aside, they'd make a lot of noise about Ukraine, but they wouldn't really do anything. And every element of that assumption turned out to be wrong. And when you think about sort of the great either intelligence failures or the great wishful thinking of the past 30 years, that was at the core.
You point out that the U.S. and European leaders, quote, projected U.S. and European thinking on authoritarian regimes. How so?
Well, we assumed that what they wanted was more interchange with the West so that they would get more trade with the West. And of course, that runs directly contrary to authoritarian, thinking. So there was Bill Clinton when he would go to Beijing University and tell the students the internet will set you free. Right? That it will undercut the Communist Party. He got it completely wrong. And by the way, I bought into that argument when he was making it. Similar problem with Russia. President Bush is floating down the Neva River outside St. Petersburg on a sort of party boat with Putin, Putin's then wife, with Laura Bush, and they're all talking about how Russia will join the European Union, how one day it might join NATO, the alliance created to contain the old Soviet Union.
The mistakes that you point out, not only just decades ago, strategic key misperceptions that the U.S. had, but also after a key moment, 2014, of course, when Russia invaded and annexed Ukrainian Crimea. And you write about, quote, the West's failure to grapple with the new reality. It was almost as if the U.S. and its NATO allies were collectively flying on autopilot, assuming that small course corrections would safely land the plane. Explain that.
That was, I think, in many ways, the most egregious example of the wishful thinking I referred to. So Putin went to the Munich Security Conference in 2007 and said, there are parts of Mother Russia that need to come back into the fold. And we pretty much ignored him and said, yeah, he's making a lot of noise for people at home. 7 years later, he took Crimea and, of course, the Donbass. President Obama did not want to challenge him. He said, I'm not going to go to war for a Russian-speaking former part of Russia. And meanwhile, the U.S. didn't even name the Russians as the aggressor in cyber attacks on the White House, the Joint Chiefs of Staff, the State Department. And so the message that Putin got was the U.S. will tolerate this stuff. And a year after he took Crimea, the German Chancellor, Angela Merkel, signed the Nord Stream 2 pipeline agreement with him. Well, that's where things were until the weekend before they invaded all of Ukraine in 2022.
Which brings us to today's policies on Russia, and let's start there in Ukraine. What is the PIT in Germany, and what is Project Maven, and how did the U.S. share a version with Ukraine?
The PIT is a place. It's an intelligence sharing operation between the U.S., the British, and the Ukrainians, although they go through this sort of odd dance because President Biden, in his effort to keep the U.S. from being a direct participant in the war, has mandated that the United States could not give exact targeting data to the Ukrainians. So in the PIT, they sort of say, well, kind of look generally over here, or we think there's interesting activity here. Project Maven is a project for integrating all of this data. It's a way of seeing on what the Pentagon calls a single plate of glass, all of what the military activity is of the enemy and also of your own forces. And what's fascinating about it is it's the war against Russia in Ukraine that has been the U.S. effort to battle test this and other technologies.
And when it comes to the Biden administration's policies on China, you point out many of the measures that were dismissed by Trump's critics at the time as hawkish or ad hoc or fear-mongering would end up repackaged and carried into the Biden years. How much continuity has there been?
None of the Trump-era tariffs on China have been lifted. I think you've got to give credit to President Biden's team for putting this into a bigger strategy of shifting forces to the Indo-Pacific, of building up the American semiconductor industry, although there were elements of that starting in the Trump era, so that we are not so dependent on those chips from Taiwan being produced 100 miles off the Chinese coast. But certainly there were elements, including banning Huawei, the Chinese telecoms company, that you saw in the Trump administration.
And finally, David, the book title, New Cold Wars. As you point out, China is much more integrated in and integral to the world economy than the Soviet Union ever was. Why do you see these as new Cold Wars?
The S in the title is important, Nick, because one of the differences from the old Cold War to what we're in now is that we have the dynamic of Russia and China operating together, as you suggested at the opening. That never happened in the old Cold War. That was exactly what Nixon and Kissinger were trying to prevent with the opening to China. Now, of course, there is a partnership without limits, or that's what Xi Jinping and President Putin called it. If, in fact, China and Russia can find something that is closer to an alliance, then we're going to be back in the hardened lines of the old Cold War, rather than this view of a globalized, borderless world that we had, a bit of a pipe dream, 30 years ago.
The book is The New Cold
Wraps it up for today's episode of The Real 411. I just want to take a moment to say thank you. Thank you to every single one of you who tuned in, who listens, who thinks about these conversations long after the episode ends. Honestly, you're the reason we do this. If you found today's discussion valuable, if it sparked something in you or made you see the world just a little differently, then hey, share it. Share the podcast with a friend, with your coworker, even with, I don't know, that one person in your life who always says, why does this even matter? Because these conversations matter. They really do. And don't forget to follow us on all the socials. Drop a comment and let us know what you want to hear next. What's on your mind? What keeps you up at night? Those are the stories we want to dive into. And make sure you subscribe to our email newsletter. Because trust me, we've got some exclusive content coming your way that you don't want to miss. Now, if you believe in independent media, the kind that digs deeper, asks the hard questions, and doesn't just settle for the headline, please consider supporting us. The Real 411 is on Substack and Fanbase, where we offer free and paid subscriptions. Every bit of support helps us keep doing this, keep digging into the truths that matter. So until next time, stay informed, stay bold, and stay real. Because at the end of the day, the story is never just the headline. Talk to you soon.